Hello everyone. Topic is unpivot and unpivot with dynamic SQL. Method 1, using the pivot function. In the first method, we use the SQL Server pivot function to transform rows into columns. The pivot operation is ideal when you have a fixed set of columns to pivot. We start by selecting the relevant data from a source table, specifically focusing on ID, subcategory, and the values associated with different categories. The pivot function then aggregates these values, summing them up for each category, and converts the category names into column headers. The isNull function is used to handle any missing values, ensuring that if a category is absent, it is represented as 0 in the result. Method 2, using conditional aggregation. The second method takes a different approach by employing conditional aggregation to pivot data. Instead of using the pivot function, we use sum along with case statements to manually handle the pivoting. For each category, we calculate the sum of values where the category matches the specified value. This approach provides flexibility, especially when dealing with multiple columns and categories, and allows for more complex aggregations. The isNull function is again used to ensure that any null results are replaced with zeros. Method 3, multiple pivot tables and joining results. The third method involves performing multiple pivot operations and then combining the results. First, we create two separate pivot tables, one for value 1 and another for value 2. Each pivot table reshapes the data to aggregate values based on categories, similar to the first method but done separately for each value column. Once we have these separate pivoted results, we join them together on ID and subcategory to produce a final result that includes all desired values. This method is particularly useful when you need to pivot different columns independently and then merge the results for comprehensive analysis. And the stored procedure dbo.create dynamic pivot, we are dynamically creating a pivot table that can handle a varying number of value columns. This procedure allows you to specify different input parameters, including the table name, the column used for pivoting, the columns to group by, and the value columns to aggregate. Procedure breakdown. Parameter initialization. The procedure starts by declaring several variables to hold SQL fragments and dynamically generated SQL code. These variables will be used to build the final SQL statements. Handling different numbers of value columns, the procedure checks the number of value columns provided. Based on this count, it adapts its logic to handle either 2, 3, or 1 value column. 2 values, it dynamically generates SQL to handle pivoting for 2 value columns. It constructs SQL to pivot the data based on these columns and categories. 3 values, it extends the logic to accommodate 3 value columns, adding more columns to the pivoted result accordingly. 1 value, for a single value column, the procedure follows a simpler pivoting approach. Creating pivot tables. The procedure creates a temporary table to store distinct pivot categories. It uses a cursor to iterate through these categories and builds a dynamic SQL statement to aggregate the values for each category. Executing dynamic SQL. The procedure assembles the final SQL command based on the number of value columns and categories. It executes this dynamic SQL to create a pivot table that aggregates the values based on the specified columns and categories. Unpivot procedure. Another procedure, dbo.create dynamic attribute an value, is defined to handle unpivoting, which is the reverse of pivoting. It converts columns into rows. This procedure involves generating dynamic SQL to unpivot the specified value columns, creating a temporary table with unpivoted data, aggregating and formatting this data into a final result set. This dynamic approach is highly flexible, allowing you to adapt the pivoting and unpivoting operations to various data sets and requirements without hard-coding column names or structures.